Welcome back to the Demo Day podcast. I'm Jackson Fordyce.
I'm Josiah Simons.
We are at 205 Hudson Street in New York City at the Square. We're with our friend Brett. Brett, thanks for coming on the show, man.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Want to give yourself an intro?
Yeah, Brett Perlmutter, founder and CEO of Bulletpitch. We like to describe ourselves as a venture media company redefining the way that venture operates from the media side to obviously the events that we do and from an investment side as well. The idea was this, right? Like fundamentally, what is venture capital? It's a commodities game, meaning what differentiates one fund's capital from another is absolutely nothing, right? Because a dollar is a dollar no matter how you split it.
Yeah.
So in that case then, what does early stage venture actually come down to? I would argue inbound strategy, but in my mind that means three things, right? One, how much value do you actually add to the companies? Two, what kind of access do you have to deals? Inbound strategy. And three, how good is your brand? During the New York Tech Week event, we had our logo on every taxi.
Yeah, I saw that. That was sick.
So if we did that, we've got this unbelievable access to these deals because of the media company. And we add a ton of value to these founders. The thesis was, well, if we were to invest, we'd be one of the most differentiated investors in the room. So we should. And so it's actually crazy because I just sent an investor update for the first company we did almost a year ago now to date, which is absolutely crushing. A company's called Posh. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them. So we did their seed, and
That's
obviously
huge.
Now they're on fire. But it was amazing because I sent this update and I was like, hey, it's crazy. It's been a year already. Look where we started. Look where they are now. But what's amazing is like the thesis worked. And it worked because I think that it's cool to say, yeah, we featured this company, right? You could say, oh yeah, it's cool. We had this company on our podcast. It's a very different thing. And there's a lot more stakes to say, not only did we call them on the media company, yeah, that's social capital, but there's actually physical capital behind this now, right? And so the syndicate launched about a year ago, and we're 7 investments in now, and it has just been red hot. It's been super cool. So Posh is one. Yeah. Rainmaker was an early one as well. And it's been really cool watching how this has unfolded.
So what is that value add that y'all provide?
Okay. I'm going to give you a fun example. See, I know we were bantering before about the New York Tech, but this is good. New York Tech Week. So you were at the event, and you meet a lot of really cool founders and funders. The people who actually benefit from that event the most are my portfolio companies. Why? I have the guest list. So I benefit from it immensely because I get to see everyone's there. I can filter and say, okay, here are these 25 consumer investors for you, this company that we're investing in called Symphony. Go ahead, tell me who you want to meet. I will give you their phone numbers before the event and say, hey, I'd love to meet you at the event. So the event's valuable for me, sure, I'm putting it on, it's part of our media business, but who it's really valuable for is the portfolio company.
Because there's also customers there too that they can also meet.
You bet. And so it's not just, here's investors, it's, hey, are there other founders you want to meet? Maybe a founder that just raised their Series A, you're about to do that. Are there potential customers you want to meet, right? And then, of course, right, there's the whole newsletter itself, right, that has its own strengths, right? We have all these partnerships now with the Googles and the Fidelities of the world. Hey, do you need us to hook you up with cloud credits? We can make all of those things happen. So immense value add.
Where did the original idea come from? How long ago was it when you developed this thesis, and how long did it take to go from thesis to actually having the
investment arm?
The investment arm, yeah.
Okay, so let's think of it in 3 tranches, so to speak. Tranche 1 was the thesis around Bulletpitch was early stage, and it's funny because so this is fun fact. Jackson was one of the first people ever subscribed to Bulletpitch, and I thought he was joking.
Yeah, he was telling about this. You thought he was lying because everyone says that, right?
And I actually looked back, and it was his Gmail that was subscribed. Maybe the first or second month we ever started this.
I have no idea how I ended up.
I don't know how either because I was like, yeah, you're way too legit to be reading this, But it was really cool because he was one of the first people, but. It started, and it's funny because you were at Fortune when this happened, so you can maybe speak to this, right? The way that early stage startups are traditionally covered in the venture media space, right? Though I would argue venture media is now kind of more what I'm doing, what Harry Stebbings is doing, right? You have a venture arm, you have a media arm. But the way it's covered in the media space, right? Think TechCrunch, Fortune, Forbes, is all about the news story. So it's what already happened,
Yeah.
right? This company, the TechCrunch article, just raised this amount of money backed by X, Y, Z.
You gotta have the big names up there. Andreessen,
Always.
General Catalyst.
And those articles do really well. And candidly, they're not a value add, right? They're great. But if you think
They're okay.
They're okay, but
They're
if you
okay.
think about it,
They're pretty much copy and paste though, like all the tech crunches.
The investor who sits on let's pretend you work in a different industry, right? Let's pretend you work in, I don't know, the markets,
Yep.
the public markets. You're on the train in the morning. What are you doing? You're reading about what has happened and what is going to happen for that day of work.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're in venture, you're only reading about what already happened.
Yeah.
There's no signaling to what's happening.
They raised 6 months ago, but they're announcing
maybe some
today.
trends. I mean, you guys are killing it with this podcast, right? People are understanding, oh, this person's in space. But really, if you're not doing creative media like this,
Yeah.
there's no real way to know what's happening. But yet, if you think about what is a fund's ultimate goal, it's not to look at a company that's already been invested in.
Yeah.
It's to try to pick off the deal before it gets done.
For sure.
So the thesis for Bulletpitch was, well, we'll be the company to cover those startups raising money. And if we cover companies that are in the process of raising, in the process of building, who's going to read it? Analyst, associate, partner, VC, any VC who's looking for deal flow.
Yeah.
The kicker with all of Bulletpitch was, right, start featuring a company once a week. The kicker was not only did it work on the VC front, founders started reading it.
Yeah.
And they said, how do I get my company featured? And that's the big unlock, because all of a sudden now we're like, well, you can apply. And then you fast forward to where we are today, we get hundreds of companies that apply. And it's basically, right, I think of the newsletter as an engine, right? We get all these companies that come in from a deal flow perspective, access, and we're able to say, wow, these are some really interesting companies that we should probably feature, right? So that was kind of how it started. That's tranche one.
Yep.
Tranche two was the events part, right? It was, hold on a second. I get all these founders now who are coming to me and saying, Brett, I know maybe you can't feature me yet, or maybe I'm too early for you. How can I get involved in your audience, with your audience in some sort of way? I know you have all these investors that read. How do I meet these investors, right? And then you get these investors that would say, you know, like get the classic email. Hey, Brett, I'm sure you guys get this too now because you're meeting a lot of really cool people, but it's like, hey, Brett, I'd love to hear about what you're seeing.
Yeah.
What does your deal flow look like, and how do I get involved? And the answer was, well, you know what? I'll put you all in a room. I'll do dinners. But nothing boring, right? I'll never do you'll never see me do a happy hour. You'll never see me do a networking panel.
Thank God.
I mean, the last event we did in LA, we had a helicopter pad and a puppy petting booth. I kid you not.
I don't even know what those 4 words mean together.
I'll give you the rundown of this event. It was awesome. So the whole idea, right, was we had all these founders and funders come in, and all of our sponsors had activations, right? So Google's activation said, we're your partner when you're hard at work and when you need a break. And it was a puppy petting booth, right? And it was
cool.
amazing because all these founders swarmed the booth, and it gave one of our partners a really great opportunity to meet amazing founders.
Right.
And then on the same token, we had this helicopter pad. And so what we did is I told every one of our partners, every single time they met a founder that they really liked, they were the only ones that had access. They could take them up to the helicopter pad.
That's it.
But all of the events we've done, and you guys have been to them,
Yeah.
right? The carnival that we do in Austin, none of them revolve around high, right? It's pitch me your game, not your company, your carnival game. And then it naturally progresses, right? And again, that's the whole ethos of, a forward-thinking media brand. But that was part two. And the reason that the events arm works so well is because, think about it, we already have an audience. So all I have to do is say, hi all, we're hosting this event, link. We get hundreds.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's just these people live in all these different cities. And then the coolest part is once you do an event in a city, you've got all these people forever. So now you can segment and say, hey, we're going to do a dinner. Hey, we're going to do...
Yeah, we're coming back to Austin or something. We're coming back to LA.
But it's funny because I've had people be like, Brett, how do you do these events at such a large scale? It's like, we have an audience, right? And when you have distribution, there's a lot of really cool things you can do with it, right?
Yeah.
And so media, events,
Yep.
and then very naturally, right? I have so many great founders. The founder I'm investing in right now, he came to one of our dinners.
Huh.
He showed up to one of our dinners, exited founder, crushed it. He was reading Bulletpitch actually because he liked some of the deal flow that we were seeing or that we were giving. And he came to this dinner because he just started this new thing. I thought it was unbelievable. Now we're investing, right? And so that's a mechanism of deal flow. So events are, obviously people applying are. And so it just made a ton of sense based on how the media company positions itself to say, okay, well, I should probably start this other thing too and capitalize fiscally on what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
I let the investors have all the fun.
Did you ever meet with Harry Stebbings and like pick his brain about that sort of model of having both a venture arm and a media company kind of combined?
So it's funny. I have not met Harry yet.
Okay.
If he's watching this, I hope he does. He is a Bulletpitch reader.
Let's go.
I know his open rate, and it's 100%.
Let's go.
All right.
And I know he really likes it. He's clicked on some things, which is awesome. But I think it's he just raised a $400 million fund.
Yeah.
Insane.
What are your thoughts on that? That's a massive fund.
Huge.
It's a really big fund. It's funny. I read the headline for some. I think it was like maybe yesterday, right? It was like he's trying to redefine like the UK specifically in terms of
make Europe great again.
And you know what? Honestly, I think it's cool because the thesis has now gone way beyond media, right? But if you take it back a level, right? I mean, Josh Muccio with the Pitch podcast, right? Packy's done a really good job with this stuff. Even these like solo GPs who have these really big media followings.
Yep.
I really believe that the future of all venture, I've heard it called venture 2.0. I like to call it like venture media. Mm-hmm. It's these venture media firms. I mean, what is Andreessen Horowitz?
Yeah,
Andreessen Horowitz to me is the only big name firm that's really figured this out.
Yeah.
They're a great investor, sure, but they're an even better media company, right? Tech Week is the biggest glorified media play I've ever seen, right? It gives Andreessen this huge name brand recognition if they even need more of it. It's brilliant. And so the model to me is so clear. And I think for guys like Harry, right, he figured out that he can use that to dovetail into a fund. And so my whole thesis is like, okay, well, I'm going to take it a step further and rather focus on sort of the space as a whole. I'm just going to focus on founders, right? It's a direct correlation now.
What are your thoughts on Redpoint though? They're VC firm. They do great work, but they also have they're heavily invested in media in the sense of they do a lot of TikTok. They do a lot of like those kind of skits with, I can't remember his name right now, Rashad or something. But do you feel like that's similar to what Andreessen's doing, or is that a completely different game in media and venture?
So here's what I would say more generally.
Yeah.
There are a lot of VC firms there are a lot of companies who are starting to invest a lot in media now, right? Because a company today knows that they need to be a media company just as much as sell the actual product they're selling, right? Unless you're like a super old school B2B SaaS company. But I've even met founders now who are selling B2B SaaS who are still doing the media thing and it works for them. I think it's really hard if you are a venture firm first to be able to redefine yourself as a media company. Andreessen from the beginning had the I think what was it, Content Eats the World, right? Or something like that. Is that what it was?
I think it's Content Eats the World, yeah.
I think so too. But their whole thing, right, was like, we are going to really focus and hone in on media and venture. And that's why you see every person who's a partner at Andreessen, which I think is actually every person.
Yeah, it's kind of a joke, right?
But, some of their larger GPs, right, they all have social followings on Twitter. It's intentional, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I would think on the back end of things, they're probably hiring like, how are you positioned in the space, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that they got it from the beginning. I think a lot of other traditional VC firms, some have tried to do the media, and I'm sure some of it has worked successfully, but I think it's really hard to redefine yourself. And that's what's really cool is like, when people recognize Bulletpitch, some of them don't even know that I invest. And I want it to be like that, right? Because most people do now, but it's not at the forefront of their mind, right? Which is why I'm hosting a dinner in 2 weeks. We're calling it Founders Giving.
Yeah.
40 founders.
In New York, where at?
In New York. And me. No VC can do that. Because otherwise it comes off of as like what are they doing? Prospecting us?
Yeah.
And that's not the intention, right? I'm building community with our audience, and I just so happen to be an investor.
Yeah. I feel like there's so many VCs too that we speak with that now want to build out their personal brand rather than like.
That's the only way that this works. Like,
yeah, really.
Because we originally thought when we started thinking about a podcast, Venture Daily was the first thing we made, and that was an easy show where it was very news focused.
I was one of your first listeners, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah.
I love you. Thank you.
And like, I think investors were like, oh, we're happy to talk on this because we can we can just kind of give our thoughts, and there's nothing that we don't have to be on camera. We don't have to go out of our way.
5-10 minutes on the phone. It's really easy.
Easy, right?
Yeah.
But then we're thinking, well, I think these people do kind of want to be on camera, which we didn't expect at first because it's venture. They're keeping their cards close to the chest. They're not typically the kind of people who want to rock the boat in terms of they might say something.
Yeah, their LPs hate and they got to like walk back that thing.
Yeah. But then we found that wasn't really the case. Like several venture capitalists told us, oh, I'd love to start my own show. Can you guys help me with that? Like almost every day we'd get somebody who's saying something like that. And it's like, wow.
And it's funny. I think I've gotten the same inquiries that you all have, right? Which is like these venture firms are like,
yeah,
how do I start a newsletter, Brad? And it's like, I just, no.
Yeah.
But it's true. And I think that I had this discovery very early on. It's funny because you would think investors know this, right? Because when you're an investor, early stage, what's one of the things that most investors say? Oh, we invest in the founder, right? It's the people just as much as it is the company, maybe even more so.
Yeah.
I remember early days when Bulletpitch was just starting to take off. We started running some ads on Twitter, and I would run these ads, and it would have like the big B logo, and like the cost of acquisition for a subscriber was still fairly decent. But then I remember the first time I ran the ads against me, right? Big picture, my face instead. People invest in people. People do not invest in brands, right? The brand is secondary. And so the idea was, when you think of like someone says 20 VC, it's like, oh yeah, Harry Stebbings.
Yeah.
Right? There's that direct correlation.
Yep.
And so one of the things I realized is like, if I can build this personal brand, it actually is going to build my company too.
Absolutely. 100%. I mean, I think that's just how we think, like as humans. You're going to see, like, I'm just going to be a much bigger fan of a person. I might be a follower of a firm or a company or a brand, but I'm going to be a fan of a person. And that's why you see, I mean, all these celebrities. Nike is a brand that people are fans of because their favorite athlete wears their shoes.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's not necessarily because...
And with Fortune, they have followers, not necessarily... Like we were looking... And I used to work at Fortune. I love Fortune. But I think they have like, 1 or 2 million followers on LinkedIn.
Like 2 million.
And they get like, 5 likes a post.
On a post.
I've actually never understood this. I feel like this is the same. I actually tweeted this like maybe 6 months ago. It's not just it's all of these companies, and you would think that like, and it's always funny because it's like someone asked me, it's like, oh yeah, you're gonna have hundreds of thousands of people apply to your events because all these corporate sponsors are gonna like repost you. I'm like, no, they're coming to me for a reason.
And if they repost you though, it doesn't really move the needle.
Not at all.
No.
But then if like you repost me,
oh yeah,
I get your whole network.
Because it's a personal brand.
100%.
And so you get all the people that follow, me or Demo Day, and they're like, oh wait, Brett's doing something really similar. Well, we like Brett. We know kind of Brett through this kind of world.
Absolutely.
I'm going to like that and follow him and subscribe to the newsletter.
Yeah.
I want to go back to tranche 1 because you mentioned, how you described it as when you meet these founders, right? When putting in the newsletter, it's one of 2 things you look for. Mission driven and founder market fit. I was listening to something earlier. You talked about that.
Good.
And
wow.
I'm curious now, but now you have hundreds and hundreds of people apply a week. Mm-hmm. How do you vet through? Well, I know there's 2 ways you vet through it, through either DocSend or Google Drive. That's like a thing you mentioned. But you can kind of go deeper into that. Yeah. But also, like, I feel like it's just way too much work to vet hundreds of founders every single week without having to meet them to know if they are mission driven or if they have founder market fit. How do you figure out who you're going to put in each week?
You nailed it that those are 2 things, right? But how do you actually, and this may be more of something on the investment side, right? Because it's like, okay, are you going to invest in, you have to know the person, right? Like I've seen people like be like, oh yeah, that's a great company. It's like, well, how do you know? Have you gotten dinner with the founder?
Yeah.
Obviously, you're correct that when we're featuring, let's call it 48, right? We take a couple breaks. Companies a year, there's no possible way. And I will meet the founders that I think are great, right? I'll always get on the phone. Every company that we feature, obviously I spend time with the founder.
Yeah.
But I can't spend so much time that I know for sure. I would argue, and I'll come back to answering this kind of at a wider spectrum, but I think that's actually okay, right? Because I think the newsletter doesn't always have to be right? And sometimes I will feature a company and I'll get our audience being like, this is the worst company I've ever seen.
You have the voting at the bottom of like, will this company make it or not make it?
Oh yeah, but
I like that.
When it gets really ugly, they don't even vote. They tell me about it, right? And it's crazy because what it really means is that it's a media company that works. Because if these people are so engaged that they want to go out of their way to tell me how bad the company was, I've got them. I've got them reading and loving the content, and it gives me so much joy to respond to them and be like, I guess we'll get them next week. You know what I mean? That being said, look, when it comes to mission idea driven, I actually think it's very easy to start to differentiate companies, right? Because ideas pivot, missions don't. And so if you like open a deck and it's like this very basic idea and there's no real concept around the why, probably not a good company. There is this other kind of piece, right? So founder market fit, but really just great founders first and foremost, mission driven for sure. But then there's this other aspect that I look for, which is I like to refer to it as community, right? Community driven companies. What does that look like? Let me give you 2 examples. Beehive. Their community round closed in, I think, and I'm not going to nail this, but like an hour. Their customers become their community members, right? Similarly, Posh, I have gone to their organizer dinners. I have never seen people so in love with a company ever, right? Their customers become their community members. That to me, and it doesn't necessarily have to be where either of those 2 companies are yet. But if you have early believers who are advocating for your company like there's no tomorrow, that is a really positive flag to me that it's like, whoa, this is something to pay attention to. Because not only are those customers sticky, they go get other customers and they become part of this brand, right? And so it's really interesting to see, which we can talk about community rounds, but like, I think that they're underutilized by some of these companies that have this pull, because all of those people now who did the community round, not only are they customers, now they're investors, now they're going to go, I mean, even like, right, with my portfolio company, it's like, someone's using like party phone, I'm like, oh, you're right. But I'm like, it's crazy because it ingrains people so deeply into these companies. And so I think, one of the things that I'll actually have a pretty good sense on as you look through decks is like, when people talk about their traction, right? It's pretty easy to see if whether it's enterprise SaaS or consumer, right? And obviously the way I'm talking about things is more consumer. You can kind of tell where things lie on the spectrum of how attached are people to the brand and the company. That's a really positive sign.
So what I'm hearing is that if you wanted to be featured on Bulletpitch, you should be leading with your customers and how much they love your brand.
100%.
Cool.
Right? Because I mean, it's the classic thing, right? And people say this, people actually say this in the newsletter industry all the time. You don't have to have 100,000 people who like don't really read your newsletter. I would rather see 100 people that are obsessed with it.
Yeah.
Right? And especially when we're playing in the B2B space, right? Those 100 people could be the Harry Stebbings types. And if you have those 100 people that are reading your work consistently, something good is bound to happen.
How do you build community that strong at that early stage of a company?
So it's a great question. And I think the only way I can answer this is how I've done it, because I believe that I've built community with Bulletpitch. And to me, it's all about brand ethos, right? Like I mentioned to you guys earlier, my whole thing is that I will not throw an event that's boring or networky. And it's intentional because I know who my customers are. I know that at the end of the day, and like, okay, I have 2 different sets of customers, right? My customers are the sponsors, of course, but I know what they want. But more importantly, it's founders, right? And I know what they want. And founders want to feel like they're part of something. Founders don't want to be pitched at. Founders are still trying to find their way. Founders are, this is a really important one, they're lonely, right? If you can understand who your customer is so well, you can tailor things, right? I know that investors don't have a lot of time, right? I'm talking about multiple segments here, but like investors don't have a lot of time. So what am I giving them? Deal flow on a silver platter, right? If you can understand your customer so well, you can usually tailor the product in some sort of way to build a community around them.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we've heard from the very beginning. When we started our founder journey with Antler, we did their residency program for 8 weeks. And that's just what they were hammering over and over again, like, which makes so much sense, right? Start with your customer. If you're building something you think is great, but then you give it to somebody and they're like, I don't really care about this. It's like you started wrong. You started with you instead of starting with them. You should be solving a problem instead of trying to figure out, does this seem like a great product to me? And I think that that's something that in media, it seems like it'd be really easy because your customer is right there on social media. They're going to comment or whatever, right? But we found that like, finding our customer has actually been kind of difficult. Like I don't exactly know what people like and dislike about our content the way that, I'd love to be able to like talk to our customers. And so because everyone's so nice, everyone's so like, oh, I love your guys'
It looks great. It's high quality. You bring on great guests, which
and
is
it's
true.
like, but let's be honest, if we get 300 views, then it's not good enough to be getting traction on YouTube. 300's fine, but it's not 10,000, not 50,000.
Listen though, I would say that the media game is an interesting one. You could put out content that's way better than the people who are getting 1 million views.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get 1 million views.
Yeah.
And there's so many other reasons behind that, right? Maybe the person started with a social following. Maybe there's all these other intricacies of it. But in my mind, and I forgot who told me this, right? Especially when it comes to making content, 99% of people don't. They don't. They sit there and they consume it. And so if you put out content, now you're already in the 1%.
Yeah.
And so eventually you're going to gain some sort of traction. And maybe it's not 1 million, but if you, and this was Bulletpitch, right? Like I started putting out this content, I started posting on LinkedIn, I started putting myself out there, right? And it's funny, I was just talking to a friend who's actually like a musical artist, and we were having this similar conversation, obviously about two very different things, but you have to just put yourself out there. And if you do, you're immediately in the 1%. Now it's just about how you scale in that 1%.
Go ahead.
I was gonna ask, how did this all start for you? Like you're a young guy, are you 24?
24.
So, I mean, you can't have been doing this that long. Was this in college you had this idea, or you always wanted to do something like Bulletpitch growing up?
It's a really good question. So I had experience in the venture space, which I loved. And I had experience in the media space, which I really loved. And it was funny because the impetus for this idea, of course, it came from the idea that some of these publications, but I was working for a podcast at the time, and it was...
This is in college?
This was, yes, in college. And I remember vividly that this podcast that I was working for interviewed very similar to like so many of these podcasts that we've seen, right? How did you do it?
Yeah.
How did you build the thing? And the podcast was called, there's How I Built This, which is like the big one. The one that I was working for was called How Success Happens. It was affiliated with Entrepreneur Magazine. It was great. But it was all about how people already did the thing. And it really got me thinking about, okay, well, that's awesome, right? But if people come to podcasts to learn, or people come to media to learn, people don't want to just know how things were already done. They want to know how someone's doing the thing, how someone can be a little bit vulnerable because, and I mean, you guys just nailed it, right? Like the clip that is going to come from this podcast of you talking about how you guys feel like you haven't found everything yet, but yet you guys are interviewing amazing people. To me, that's so much more valuable than the person who is like, yeah, I made $100 million and like, I don't really know what to do with my life now, because they've already done the thing.
Yeah.
And so this whole kind of, right, I had this venture experience, I had this prior media experience, and I realized that they were so similar, right? It's like if you can put out content, one, people come to you, right? I was watching this, every week the podcast gets released on, I think it was like Bulletpitch is Tuesdays, I think this is on Wednesdays. Podcast comes out on Wednesday. That day, they get all this inbound from potential new guests, right? And so that was like wonder if that would work for deal flow. But also like, if I could highlight people who really actually needed the, let's chalk it up to what it is, PR, there'll probably be a lot of people, and that's what all these founders needed, right? And so to me, it was like this cool marriage of like, I understood how venture worked. You were starting to see these people come out of the woodwork who were doing this media approach to venture. Is there an opportunity to marry the two? And I've been entrepreneurial my entire life.
You mentioned the PR thing. Like, how do you balance that of you want to give your customers, your audience, the most authentic, real, raw stuff. At the same time, you know that most of the people, founders who are coming to you to like, hey, feature my stuff, it is kind of a PR grab. So how do you, kind of know when it's just PR and when this is real, and I'm gonna really draw out the rawness of this founder or this team?
So it's an amazing question, and I think I like that. Can I get one too? I think that comes down to one answer, one thing, which is social capital. And one of the things that I've realized about the venture space, and I'm sure most people have, even if they're not too afraid to admit it, venture is just as much about social capital as it is fiscal capital, right? And the idea that early days, I treated Bulletpitch like an investment firm, except we weren't investing capital. We were investing social capital, which arguably is just as valuable. And so if you look at a Y Combinator of the world, they do the same thing, right? I mean, of course they give capital, but why do founders go to Y Combinator and then they go, I don't really want to go to some of these other accelerators? It's a stamp of approval.
Yeah, it's the Y Combinator brand.
Exactly.
Put in your Twitter bio,
their
YC.
social capital just as much as their fiscal capital. And so the idea is that, okay, well, if obviously I'm not giving capital, but if I treated all these companies the same way and I gave them my social capital, I invested my social capital into them, then of course, like, yes, there's a PR element to this, but really I'm no different than any firm. I'm just using a different medium to convey it.
Do you ever get imposter syndrome?
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah, all the time.
You know, look, so when we started hosting these events, it became a little more real to me, because obviously when you're like behind a computer screen, you're like, oh yeah, like these people read it, but like you don't actually know, right?
Yeah.
And the funny thing I always say is, like, if you're a newsletter or media company, right, and you really want to see how engaged your audience is, throw an event.
Yeah.
Right? Because based on how many people come to that event is how engaged your audience actually is. And it's funny because I literally now, like, on our media kit, when I talk to these sponsors, I just use our events as our traction. I'm like, if you're curious, check out this video, because 90% of these people came through the newsletter, right?
Sick. Did you ever have one fail? Like, you ever have an event where like pretty much no one showed up?
Flop.
You know what? No.
Wow.
And honestly, like, and it's not because like one's not going to happen in the future.
Sure.
I think I'm so paranoid as a human being that I just would never let that happen. Like, I actually thought this LA one had a shot at failing because I just was like, people, they call it LATE, right? Like late for a reason.
Right. Yeah.
People in LA all sign up for stuff last minute. And so I panicked. And so I started like figuring out, like, call people. And I was like, hey, like, do you think you could get people to this event? Like, if I need.
Yeah.
So not yet. Not to say it's not going to happen, but your question before was a really good one, and I wanted to answer it, which was
Imposter syndrome.
imposter
Do you ever
syndrome.
get that?
So I threw an event. It was a dinner about a little over a year ago now, and I remember sitting down at this dinner, and I had this weird thing hit me, and it's never hit me like this before. And I like looked around, and I was like, "Holy shit!" 3-4 years ago would never have even been invited to this. And now I'm hosting it?
Yeah.
And I actually said that to one of the people there, and he was like, yeah, you are. And it's amazing. And like, you should put your foot forward and be like, yeah, I'm hosting this thing. Right. And like, normally that's what I do, but it was one of those moments where I was like, oh my God, like, I'm really doing this thing. But I think at the end of the day, right, it's funny. This actually inspired a couple people, which was pretty cool. When I first started Bulletpitch, I did not want people to know that I was on the younger side, because I thought that it would be a detriment. And I just celebrated my birthday, and I posted this thing that went pretty decently viral. And it was something along the lines of like, I used to be afraid of it, but it's actually my biggest superpower. And I believe it because I had this thought maybe a couple of weeks ago. I was in the shower. I was like, oh no, like, I'm getting to the point where like there's gonna be like another Brett that comes along that's like also like young and killer, and like he's gonna be smarter than I am because he's gonna see things that I am not seeing because he's just thinking in a different way.
Younger, maybe grittier, all that.
Maybe I'm washed up, but like
you're getting old, man.
But it was one of those things for me where I'm like, it's a superpower. It's a superpower being one of the younger ones in the room. And it's like every single time I host a dinner, I know I'm objectively the youngest person there. Yeah. Like, it's gotten closer now where like maybe there's some like 26, 27, you know, maybe even not. There are a few founders who are my age. I mean, Avante's my age.
That's us, man.
We invest in another founder who's my age. But like, for the most part, I'm the youngest in the room always. But I used to be like, all right, well, no one will know. But now I'm like, I want everyone to know.
Yeah.
Because I become differentiated in the way I think. And so imposter syndrome for sure. And I think that will never go away until maybe I'm 50, but even then, like, who knows? But like, I think what it really comes down to is like, I've realized that that's actually a strength of mine, and to embrace it.
When we were in LA, we were meeting with Tyler Dank, Beehive's founder, and we kind of talked about the same sort of thing. Like, you grew up dreaming of being a founder, but did you ever kind of see yourself hitting this big, having a company of over 75 people, a newsletter platform that sends out, I think it's over 2 billion emails per month now. So massive company and only growing. And he was kind of like, I'm not going to lie. Yeah, I did see myself doing this. And it was like, that's sick, because like he didn't, I don't know, it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. We talked about it on that show as well, of like when people say, if you would have told me that I'd been here, I never would have believed you. It's like, why not? Why couldn't you have like gotten there in your mind of believing that you could do something this great or this exceptional or whatever? And so I think I like your answer that you're saying like, I do feel the imposter syndrome, but at the same time, I have these moments where I realize, no, like I've done this and like I'm worthy of this and I'm worthy of more. And I can see myself in 5 years doing something even greater.
I think what it comes down to is understanding what your strengths are, right? And like over this journey, I've always known what I was really good at, but now that I've been doing this, I know what puts me above the rest in some categories. And because of that, it's really helped me be like, oh yeah, like I kind of am meant to do this, right? And like, to be honest with you, I come from a similar boat that Tyler was in, where it's like, I didn't know what exactly it was, but I'm fairly certain that I was going to end up on a bit of a different path maybe than some of my peers at this point. And I still believe that I have ways to go in terms of where I want to get to, but I also envision myself there. And I think like, I grew up as an athlete, right? Like there's that thing of visualization. It's like when I was younger, like I literally I'd have a swim meet, right? And I would go to bed and I would dream about myself touching the wall in a certain amount of time. And it was scary. It would usually get pretty close. And it's the same thing now where it's like, I know exactly where I want to be. I have a clear vision for kind of how this continues to progress. And it's not really that hard to figure out, right? It's like when you're investing with but for me, it's like, okay, now I'm just going to get there. And now I'm confident enough to be able to continue to do this. And what's cool, and this is the best part, right, is you always tell a story in retrospect, right? So it's really hard to tell a story when you start because you don't have a lot to go off of. But now I'm at a point where I can clearly be on this podcast and tell you guys, this was year 1, this was year 2, this was year 3, and it makes it a lot easier to predict the future and be right about it because you've got a lot of learnings to go from.
So how does year 4 and 5 look like?
If you were me, what would you do next?
Have you started a podcast?
It's a great question. And the answer is no.
How come?
Until January.
Okay. Yeah.
Can we keep that in there or no? Can we keep that in there?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
It's funny. I just posted something on LinkedIn the other day where the studio that I'm using, the guy like is promoting it. And I was like, I'm a customer. More soon.
What's the focus of that going to be?
The concept of the podcast, I'm comfortable talking about this. It's going to be called Emerging. And the idea is going to be that there are a lot of people, not necessarily subject to just venture, and this is intentional, that are emerging in their respective industries, right? And what Bulletpitch does fundamentally is we cover companies that are emerging. We cover founders that are emerging. And I think there's a really big opportunity to cover people that are emerging beyond just the venture space, right? When we talk about music, like these different elements, because musicians are still entrepreneurs, right? In my mind. And there's some other elements or some other industries where that regard is true. And so this podcast is going to really focus on these people who are emerging. And the whole idea is like, if you could catch Mark Zuckerberg, if you could catch, I don't know, John Summit before he was huge, you would want to listen to how he's thinking about the world, right? And going back to that podcast that I worked for, that was the podcast I wish I got to listen to, right? And of course, there's podcasts I want to listen to like this. Like, God knows that we need a venture podcast that's just talking about venture news all day because none of us have that right now. So keep doing this. Yeah. But like, I think there's a real opportunity to also interview emerging people where then you can look back on it and be like, whoa, Like, I got that person, and now look where they are. It's pretty cool.
And that's what this episode is going to be. When people look back in the next 5 years, like, how did you got Brett on this show when he was, at this point in his career?
You got to do that though for us. You got to blow up.
I hope so, guys.
What do you feel like is the greatest like obstacle in your way, or your greatest weakness as a founder right now that you would say is holding you back? I know it's like maybe hard to think about, but I'm sure in the same way that you're thinking about all these things you're doing right, you've also got to be constantly thinking about, okay, what can we improve? What is something that is constantly on your board of like, still not hitting this mark the way I want to be?
So it's, first of all, okay, I'm going to like break that down into like 3 different things. Firstly, thank you for saying I'm a founder, because I think that sometimes people are like, oh yeah, you're an investor. Can I go on a little bit of a tangent here? I promise I'll come back to your question.
Absolutely.
So there was a venture firm that I applied to my senior year of college. It's funny. I've been on a bunch of podcasts like fairly recently, but none of them are getting released till January. I think I've told the story now twice, but it's so good. So like we're doing it.
Yeah.
There was a venture firm that I applied to, and I got to the final round, and I remember they asked me these questions, and they were like, what, this, and I was like crushing all of these, and I was like, I'm getting this job. And they got to a question, and this was right around where I started Bulletpitch, and they go, so what are some media sources that you lean into to learn about the venture space? And I said, honestly, I think that they're all subpar. Next question. They're all subpar, and I think someone, I'm like winking to myself, needs to innovate in that space to cover companies that you can find, because when you are doing these VC interviews, right, they're like, oh, what are 5 companies that you're looking at? And it's like, oh, like now I got to go to everyone's portfolio and find one. There's not like a source I could just be like, oh, well, Bulletpitch featured this, and this. So that was my answer. The next day, I get a rejection email, and I'm like, brutal. I was so close to the finish line. Why didn't I get it? And I think I'd maybe started Bulletpitch like 2 weeks earlier. And what was crazy is I had a friend at the time who was working at that firm, and I called her and I was like, hey, do you think that maybe you could figure out what I did wrong? I wanted feedback, but really I was like, I want to know what I did. Like, how did I not get it?
Yeah.
And I get the response, which is, it's funny. I looked at it, and you got really high marks across the board except for that one question. And they wrote in, doesn't know any media company. They thought I didn't know them.
So if you would have said like the big 3 or the big 4
and so I was fuming, and I was like, do I call? No. So I ended up starting Bulletpitch, like kind of on the back of that a little bit, because I was like, all right, fuck it. If they don't want to hire me, I'll just do it myself. And I think that thesis is actually correct. And what's so wild is that I had an intern last year who applied to that same firm. And I'm like very friendly now with a bunch of the people there, and like, we've co-invested. And the intern was like, do you have any advice? And I was like, it's funny. I actually got rejected from that firm. And she was like, wait, how? I don't understand. And it like clicked in that moment where I was like, oh my God. I don't actually think I was ever, I actually think they made the right decision. She was like, well, what do you mean? Like, you've figured out how to, I go, no. That answer was an answer that an investor would never give, ever, right? Because an investor would be like, oh yeah, these are the 3 things, let's go. That's the answer that a founder would give. I see something wrong, I want to innovate. And so I actually think that this firm made an incredible move by not hiring me, because I think I would have been a terrible employee for them. Because I'm not truly an investor, I'm a founder who just happens to have figured out how to build an investment arm.
Yeah.
It created Brett, the founder, not Brett, the investor.
Correct. Which is where I think I needed to lean into the entire time. But to that point, I was like, yeah, I want to be an investor.
Yeah.
No.
Circling back on what's the weakness right now? What's the thing that you're running up against the hardest right now?
Oh my God, there's a million weaknesses. I think I focus all of the time only on the weaknesses, to a point where I'm sure you guys do. I'm sure every good founder does this, right? Where you're like, there's so much that's going really well. But that's kind of like whatever, right? And I've had people gut check me, be like, Brett, have you realized what you guys have accomplished so far? And believe me, it's been amazing. And I don't focus on that, because I only focus on the things that I can do better, right? being a better leader. You know, specifically, I think that I have to find a way to manage my time better, right? I feel like I'm always working, right? And I see some of these founders who have matured a little bit with their companies and they've figured out a way to delegate really well. I still have a really hard time doing that. I mean, I could go on and on with things.
Maybe then I'll ask more personally, not just in the business, but more personally, what is Brett working on,
Great
like
question.
in your time when you go to bed at night and you think, I wish I was better at this as a person?
You know, this is the thing that I actually have made progress on, but I'm still not there yet. And it's being able to separate work and personal. Because this industry, and you guys know it, is really social, right? And you want to be homies with all of the people that you work with, all the founders, and you can be. But sometimes, and I've done this now, where I try to protect some of my weekends, where I'm like, I'm only going to hang out with my friends from high school. I'm gonna hang out with my friends from college. I'm gonna hang out with my New York City friends who are not in this space. Because what happens is every single time you do hang out with people in space, because everyone loves it so much,
That's all you talk about.
That's all you talk about.
Yeah.
And that has been a big unlock for me, but also something that I still work on, because like I'll do something and I'll I'll be like, to call two of my friends. Hey, I'm having dinner. By the way, there's this really cool guy that's gonna come by named Jackson, and like I'd love you to meet him. And then like you and I start like bantering about it, and it's just like it's great. But that has been something that I don't know when it's gonna. I don't think I'll ever be done working on this. But it's how do I differentiate between like my non-work business life and because it's so similar and I'm the same person in both.
Yeah.
But it's hard because it's like you need to stop sometimes, because this is one of those industries. I mean, I know this. You get founders who work literally 7 days a week. I mean, I work every weekend. I don't actually I couldn't imagine not working on the weekends, right? Like weekends are my time to get ahead so that I can fall behind during the week.
Coming to a close here, and what's next for Bulletpitch for 2025? What are you looking forward to? What is the company going to accomplish? What's a big goal of yours?
I think there's two things, right? Let's give it three. One, expanding on the media front. I think we are very early still in some of the media stuff I want to accomplish, and the last 3 years was big on me establishing the three kind of things that I am focused on. But now it's fun because I want to pour some fuel on some of these other areas, right? And so the first is the podcast, right? But it goes beyond that, right? It's building a social presence across platforms. That's a big piece. On the syndicate, we did a good amount of deals this year. I want to try to see if we could double the pace. I think we can now based on, the amount of people that we have, which is great. And then,
Are you hiring right now, or did you just hire?
For the event side, I'm likely going to bring someone in to run the events, because it's not an easy thing to do.
I bet.
About time. And but look, all that said, I think anyone who's been paying attention to this, what's pretty cool is there actually have been. There's this sort of trend, right, where it's like media company. Now there's events. Now there's a syndicate, which is not quite a fun, but he's doing something close. What sort of comes next? And I'm not going to drop the F-bomb on you guys, but like you can guess it, right? Yeah. And it feels like it's a natural progression. And so I'm not in a rush to get that started, but if it doesn't happen, I would be pretty shocked.
Very cool.
Dude, Brett, we really appreciate your time, man.
This is great, guys.
Thanks for coming on the show, dude. We really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.